What up, Wizards? It's Dev, aka SPMT Jesus. We like it in Magic. And you know, a rule here on YouTube is that you're supposed to talk about what people are talking about. So today we're going to do that with the only card in Strixhaven that people seem to be talking about. But I can see why, because she is a clever girl. Are Jurassic Park memes like way too dated for YouTubers to be talking about them? Probably, but I just needed a cheap joke to segue into what we're really talking about, which is clever Lumimancer, and also to an extent Big Kitty Boy Leonin Lightscribe. And I could tell you what I think the best Lumimancer builds in Standard are right now. We could do that if you wanted to, but today it's going to be different. I'm gonna teach you to fish. It sounds so condescending. Every time I do a take with it, I'm like, I don't like the way that sounds. So let's ditch the homespun wisdom routine, and let's just say that instead of our normal deck format today, we're going to take a super deep dive and talk about all the ways that you can build around Clever Lumimancer and Leonin Lightscribe right now. Ladies and gentlemen, how to brew Clever Lumimancer.
And I'm your favorite Magic Channel's favorite Magic Channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck text. I come correct like a porn star, slicing up all these other suckers with my sword mark.
And we're back. Remember, by the way, just before we jump in, because it's probably going to be a relatively long one, like and subscribe if you enjoy the content, do the things. There's going to be more content, so you want to subscribe, Patreon, Twitch, do the things. Links in the description if you're interested in any of that. Let's go ahead and get into the video. And we're going to go color by color here, talking about all the different cards that you could brew if you're trying to build around these two cards. And I think it's probably good to start with white because it's first color in the color pie for some reason anyway, and you've got to play the color anyway. So let's look at all of the best creatures and spells that you can play in white. Now, there are some white spells that I not only think go in the deck no matter how you build it, but are also perfectly emblematic of what we're looking for from our spells in general. Defiant Strike, Show of Confidence, and Fight as One are not only spells we want, but we want these kinds of spells specifically. Now, Fight as One is the cheapest way in the format to protect not only a Lumimancer, but a Lightscribe at the same time, because obviously Lumimancer is a human, Lightscribe is not. So for just one mana, you give them both indestructible at instant speed, and that can ruin a lot of plans, whether your opponent's trying to cast mass removal or targeted removal, or just get a good block in against you. Fight as One is an amazing way of beefing not one, but two members of your team at the same time, and really getting through. So not only do we need Fight as One specifically, but again, we need cheap protection spells like Fight as One, because this deck isn't going to play all of the creatures in the world, and often you're just going to have 2-3 creatures out at any given time, and you have to make sure they stay on the battlefield. And again, Fight as One is the cheapest way of doing that, but we need to look for these cheap protection spells in just about every color and play the best ones. Defiant Strike actually does 3 things we want it to do. It's a super cheap spell. We're looking for as many of those as possible. It also draws a card. Make sure that we draw into more spells, keep casting them, and pumping our Lumimancer. Card draw is incredibly important to us, especially when it comes on the cheap. And after all that, it's also a pump spell. So just again, I think Defiant Strike goes in every single build of this deck, as does Show of Confidence, for that matter. Show of Confidence is kind of our coup de grace finisher spell, right? We're looking to cast it on turn 4, maybe go 1 mana spell, Show of Confidence, probably during our attack step. But there are some other really good spells in white that I don't think go in every single time, but come very, very close. Things like Guiding Voice, for instance, which is another pump spell and pretty reminiscent of Defiant Strike, despite the sorcery speed. Taking away instant on this really does hurt, but being able to effectively draw a card and pump a creature for only 1 mana is a really good impression of Defiant Strike, and I think most decks are going to want a copy of this card. But white also has a fair number of ways to protect creatures or get them through with protection, right? Things like Feat of Resistance or Sigiri Shelter or even Beaving Defiance, but I don't think Defiance is what you really want to be on. I'd rather have things like Sigiri Shelter, which can act as a land, get a creature through for a lot of damage, or just make sure it doesn't die to a removal spell. Of these, I think Sigiri Shelter is easily the best. Now, a couple other white spells to look at when you're building this deck, especially if you're making it mono-white, are Academic Probation and Wings of the Cosmos, which is a cool little sleeper pick for the deck. And even though I don't think it goes in every build, I do think it's an interesting little card. Just 1 white mana for a decent little pump spell that pumps more defense than offense, but you'd be surprised how many bad spots this will get a Lumimancer out of sometimes. But it also gives the creature flying, so there are some board states where you just give a Lumimancer flying and it's game over. All for 1 mana That's not a bad deal. You're really just looking at opportunity cost at this point. Are there better cards you could be putting in your deck? And 9 times out of 10, I think there are, but I still think it's worth checking out Wings of the Cosmos if you're looking to fill out a few slots left in your deck. Aside from that, Academic Probation can go in if you're playing like Guiding Voice and other learn cards. I think this is a great one to go get from the sideboard. With Guiding Voice, it's just 3 mana to cast 2 spells, and sometimes it doesn't even matter what those spells do. You're just trying to pump your Lumimancer, your Light Scribe, and all your other creatures. So the good thing about these spells, though, is that they have text on them. And Academic Probation can keep a creature from blocking. That actually combos fairly well with Wings of the Cosmos sometimes. Keep their 1 blocker from flying. Give your Lumimancer flying, get in. So these are pretty cool spells, and I think that often you'll play Academic Probation in the sideboard if you play Learn no matter what, but don't play it in the main deck. As far as Wings goes, again, I think this is mostly for mono-white builds. In other colors, there are just better cards you could be playing, but it's still a cool card. Now, white also has a pretty decent complement of creatures. Again, this deck needs to play at least 16 creatures, and some builds will play 18 to 20, although every creature you play above 16 is a spell that you can't play. So there is kind of a balancing act that we're trying to do in the deck. You definitely can't play like 24 creatures in here and like 16 spells or whatever. It's just not going to work. So you really don't have a lot of slots for creatures. You have to be very careful. But again, white does have some good ones like All-Seed of Life's Bounty and Selfless Savior. I especially like All-Seed because it has the lifelink. That way, if it gets boost from Leonin Lightscribe or Show of Confidence, Defiant Strike, or whatever, you gain a little bit of life, or sometimes it can be so big that the lifelink is effectively impossible for your opponent to get past. So, I kind of like All-Seed in the deck, and it can also sack to give a Lumimancer protection from a color, get through for a turn sometimes. However, it does cost mana to use its ability, and often you'd be surprised how often you need to squeeze every little mana out of every little turn, so that 1 mana is more daunting than you think it might be. Altogether, though, I'm not sure either of these are perfect for the deck, but they are creatures you want to look at. There are some other 1-drop creatures that I like Fairy Guidemother and Giant Killer. Both of these are spells that are also creatures, and this is the exact kind of deck that might want something like that, right? So, especially Fairy Guidemother, this can get through a Lumimancer with flying for a turn and give it basically a 4 power boost, and then come down as a flyer and get Lumimancer and Show of Confidence boosts and stuff like that, deal a little extra damage. Flying is important to a deck like this, so I do like Fairy Guidemother more than I probably should, but the fact that it's not only a spell, it's a pump spell, it's cheap, and it's a cheap creature that flies, I think there's kind of a lot to be said about Fairy Guidemother in this deck. But as far as Giant Killer, this won't always find a target, and when it does, it's really expensive to cast the spell half, at least relative to what this deck wants to spend on spells. And once you get the Giant Killer down, it's not super impressive in terms of attacking, but sometimes it can tap down a creature and let you get through. But altogether, even though Giant Killer is a spell and a cheap creature, I don't think it's ideal for the deck. Now, there's a bunch of 2-drops that I do and don't like for this deck, but I nonetheless should bring them all up. Things like Professor of Symbology, Hero of the Pride, Hushbringer. I think these are all interesting cards, especially Hushbringer. It's got flying and lifelink, and we don't really have any ETB trigger stuff in this deck that we care about, so it won't really hurt us too much if we play Hushbringer. I think it's an interesting choice, but I don't necessarily think it's the best choice. Hero of the Pride, that's a cool call too, but I think it's a little bit fragile in a lot of situations, and you're not going to get all the power in the world out of it. Professor of Symbology effectively draws a card, but then it's just kind of a lame body after that, so these are 2-drops you could play, but I don't like them anywhere near as much as I do cards like Seasoned Hallowblade, obviously, and Clarion Spirit. This deck is going to be looking to play multiple spells just about every turn, especially after it gets set up. Flying is decent for the deck. Clarion Spirit is a way to go wide, and the deck could be interested in going wide. We only get to play, sorry Ziggy, we only get to play like 16 creatures in this deck, so a creature that makes creatures is not too bad, but of course, the body isn't amazing either. I'm not super impressed by Clarion Spirit, but we're playing enough spells in this deck that I think that it's definitely one of the white 2-drops, one of the white creatures, period, that's the most worth looking at for this deck. But I guess we'll finish up the white creatures by looking at Mavinda. How many copies of this card do you play, if you play any? Because I'm still not sure this is a necessary inclusion, but I've been on 2 for the last few days playing different versions of this deck, and I think 2 is pretty good. Now, Mavinda's stats are not very impressive for the mana cost, and she will die to like Frostbite, and obviously Heartless Act, Eliminate, and stuff like that. So Mavinda isn't great in terms of fragility issues, but you can always play Mavinda on turn 4 or turn 5 and back it up with a Fight as One that's in your graveyard. or Sajiri Shelter that's in your graveyard. So once you have enough mana, it's fairly easy to protect a Mavinda. The only problem is when the deck has 4 and 5 mana, it doesn't want to be doing that stuff with a Mavinda. It would rather be attacking in with Lumamancer and Lightscribe, using all of its mana to cast spells and get in for a lot of damage or whatever. But a 2-of has gotten me out of some jams in the last few days as I've been testing different versions of this deck. So I'm not ready to cut Mavinda from my piles yet, but I will acknowledge that Mavinda might not be the perfect card. That said, if the deck has to go late into certain games, Mavinda's almost always our best friend. But let's slide the color wheel over to blue and see what blue spells and creatures we might consider if we're building this deck and we want to make it Azorius. Now, blue does have some interesting ways of protecting creatures, but I don't love them as much as I like some of the white spells, right? Things like Shell Shield, Starlit Mantle, and Keep Safe are just not amazing cards, right? Especially considering that Starlit Mantle looks like it might be the best one of these because it provides a boost, but it's an aura, so it doesn't give you instant sorcery procs, and that's kind of lame. You know, you want to proc Magecraft as much as possible. That said, Keep Safe, a little expensive, even though it does draw you a card in the long run, which might be one of the best things about it. Shell Shield, for just 1 mana, will protect a creature from a Bone Crusher Giant or something, and for 2 mana, protects a creature from a whole lot more. I don't love this spell, though, to be honest. Shell Shield does not look like one of the better things you could play. You know, for 1 mana, compare that mode to a Fight as 1. You probably want to play Fight as 1 in your deck. So, and again, compared to Fight as 1, things like Keep Safe and Starlit Mantle are just nowhere near as good. So I don't know that I'm convinced I want to play any of these blue protection spells in my deck. But blue can obviously protect its creatures by countering spells too, and I'm a little bit more interested in that. You know, cards like Concerted Defense and Miscast and even good old Negate are worth looking at. Although, when it comes to Negate, I think Keep Safe would probably be better for our purposes than Negate is a lot of the time. Although Keep Safe obviously can't counter a Planeswalker or something, but, you know, Keep Safe is at least going to draw us the card, and that's going to be better than what Negate can do for the function we want it to be used for a lot of the time. And I don't even want to play Keep Safe, so I'm more interested in 1 mana counter spells like Defense and Miscast. Now, one of the problems I've been having with Miscast and testing this deck is that things like Skyclave Apparition, Binding the Old Gods, there's a whole lot of cards right now that play right through a Miscast, no matter how much you put this in your deck and you think, I'm going to counter every Heartless Act. Like, yeah, you probably are in the early game, but there's a bunch of stuff that plays around Miscast and you're just going to feel bad some of the time, so it's not as good as I wanted it to be. You know, Concerted Defense, hey, it looks good, right? Because Lumamancer's a wizard, Lightscribe is a cleric. Seems like it would find a home in this deck, but the board's not going to be set up that way all the time, or even most of the time. So, just Concerted Defense isn't going to be the card you want it to be a lot of the game, especially starting on turn 3, 4, 5. The card just gets really, really bad as the game goes on. And even though you don't want the game to go on for super long, you also don't really want to be holding up your mana a lot of the time to do stuff that doesn't draw cards or pump your creatures more than, you know, the normal Magecraft boost. Concerted Defense is a sweet card, but there's a reason we're playing things like Fight as 1, right? Because this not only pumps our Lumimancers, our Lightscribes, because it's an instant and sorcery, but unlike things like Concerted Defense and Miscast, it also makes our creatures a little bit bigger that turn. It's a pump spell and a protection spell, and blue just doesn't really provide anything like that. So even though it's kind of tempting to play things like Concerted Defense and Miscast, I found a whole lot of situations where they just don't work the way I wanted them to. Of course, that doesn't mean there aren't really good blue spells that I think you want to play pretty much every time if you're going to put blue in the deck. If you insist, you should probably play Opt and Of One Mind. Of One Mind is a bonkers card if you can get it for just 1 mana, and it's not super hard. I mean, again, Lumamancer's a human, Lightscribe is not. Of One Mind is 1 mana that draws you 2 cards and pumps both of them. In that situation, it's a ridiculous gas, especially if it draws you into more cheap instants you can keep proccing. So just Of One Mind is maybe one of the absolute best reasons to play blue, but Opt ain't bad either. It's always 1 mana, no matter what the board state is, and it always draws you more cards while filtering a draw for you. Just an unbelievable card, right? I don't think that Opt and Of One Mind are worth playing blue just for these 2 cards, but these are probably 2 of the best cards we could play in the entire format that draw more cards. But as far as, I guess, the other category for blue spells goes, I want to look at Stern Dismissal, Unsubstantiate, and Sleep of the Dead, which is kind of my sleeper pick for this deck. I'm not sure it's worth the opportunity cost to put Sleep of the Dead in your deck, especially if you can't find a target, but it's just 1 mana the first time you cast it, helps you get through with the Lumamancer and not really worry about the crackback too much, so that's pretty sweet. And you can escape it for a relatively low cost, especially once the game goes on if you got a little bit more mana. So, you know, there's kind of a lot that I like about Sleep of the Dead. We'll just put it that way. It's not a terrible card, even if it's also not a great card. Stern Dismissal is just 1 mana tempo, so it's probably worth at least bringing up, although of course it needs to find a target. That's the thing, is that we really want to play spells in this deck that don't need to have a target on board if we can possibly help it, right? Just the best spells we could look to play are spells that we can play no matter what, and Stern Dismissal isn't necessarily one of those spells, although very often it will find a target. And for just 1 mana, it's worth looking at, but also like Unsubstantiate, because this can not only affect the stack, but it also affects the board state. So if your opponent is trying to kill one of your Lumimancers with a Heartless Act or something, you can just send that back to their hand. Hopefully they don't have the mana to cast it again or whatever, you know. But, you know, we're trying to play a tempo game. If we play, whether we play blue or not, we're playing a tempo game with this deck a lot of the time. So Unsubstantiate can be very valuable tempo, right? Just sending that Heartless Act back to their hand can be the difference for 1 turn, can be the difference between victory and defeat. So, you know, it's good tempo that is basically a protection spell that also gets stuff off of the battlefield so that we can attack him with the Lumimancer. There's a lot that I like about Unsubstantiate. Even if I don't think it's a perfect card for the deck, it's definitely one I've got my eye on. Now, there aren't a ton of blue creatures that I really want to play in this deck, but I think it's worth bringing up Brazen Borrower, Seagate Stormcaller, Symmetry Sage, and Riddle Form. But I'll talk about Brazen Borrower and Stormcaller first, because I think they're the best for the deck. Brazen Borrower has Flash, has 3 power, has Evasion. That's not actually terrible in terms of what this deck is looking for in a creature, but, you know, it also gives us a little bit of tempo, gets a creature off the board so we can attack, or maybe if all goes horribly wrong in a block or an attack step or something like that, we just return the big things, the big scary man to our opponent's hand, the Brazen Borrower, and that's all good. But 2 mana is kind of actually a lot for the spell mode on this in terms of what we want, again, spells to cost and do in this deck. 2 mana is actually kind of a lot, and we don't really want to hold up mana to play the creature half of Brazen Borrower with Flash anyway. So again, if there was a creature I wanted to play in blue, it would probably be Brazen Borrower. I'm just acknowledging that there are some downsides to the card. Seagate Stormcaller, I really like this, you know. I will say, though, that it's just a 2/1 body if you play it in the early game, and very often you're looking to just play a body on turn 2. In this deck, you're still setting up, you want a creature on turn 2, and Seagate Stormcaller isn't great then, and it's not truly great until the much, much later game. For a deck that only runs, you know, 20 to 22 lands, it's going to be a while before you can actually get to Stormcaller and play a spell Snapcaster style, so, you know, it's a little bit clunky in terms of what you want to be doing with your slots in this deck, is all I'm saying. And as far as Symmetry Sage and Riddle Form, I don't like these as much as the first 2 creatures I talked about, but Symmetry Sage is at least interesting. I've just come to the conclusion that I think this is more for limited play, doing Magecraft, fun stuff with Lumimancer and other cards in limited, but I'm not sure that this is actually like a standard viable way for this deck to go, especially considering, again, we're not really going wide in this deck, so like you can give Symmetry Sage and Lumimancer base power too, with, you know, 2 spells on your turn, but you really haven't done as much as you'd have liked to do. You know, I kind of look at this card as like a Lumimancer that can only pump once in a turn, right? Or it can pump twice so long as you have it and a Lumimancer out. So there are cool things about it, but I'm just not sure that it's worth playing. If you're looking for 1 mana creatures in blue, though, it's probably your best bet. As far as Riddle Form goes, this is actually pretty cool. You know, it beats sorcery speed, sweepers, and stuff like that, and other sorcery speed removal. And the deck actually does ostensibly want cards like that, but the problem is we are going to be playing a lot of pump spells and whatnot in this deck, spells that specifically target one of our creatures. So if we don't have a creature on board and all we have is a Riddle Form, which is actually a far more common situation than you might think it is, we just can't turn on our Riddle Form, and that's a really crap situation to be in. So I've tried Riddle Form in this deck, and I think that actually it could work as like a 1 or 2 of, but in the end, I'm just not sure that it's worth it in general. It doesn't, when you cast it, it doesn't proc Magecraft or anything. That would be cool, but, you know, instead it's just a card that you devote 2 whole mana to, very often your second entire turn to this card. And then it doesn't really pay you in the dividends that you'd like it to pay you in. So let's keep it moving here to black on the color wheel. Now, there's a fair number of black spells that I'm actually fairly interested in playing here, but as far as like what black gets in its protection spell suite, I'm actually not loving it too super much. We've got things like Unlikely Aid and Professor's Warning, and even though Professor's Warning is just 1 mana for either a pump spell or an indestructible, which actually isn't bad, I still compare it to cards like Fight as One, and Fight as One is just obviously a much better card, so I'm not sure how much you want to play this, and I think Unlikely Aid is right out. 2 mana for this is just a little bit much, even though, again, pump spell and indestructible can matter because it kind of has 2 modes on it. Are you getting in for effectively 4 extra damage with a Lumimancer when you cast this? That's not bad. Are you also sometimes just protecting a Lumimancer from a Heartless Act? That's good too. So Unlikely Aid isn't as bad as I'm making it sound here. I just think there's way better choices for protection spells if you're going to play this thing. Now there's obviously a ton of good black removal. We all know about Heartless Act, Eliminate, Bloodchief's Thirst. You know, these are cards we're all fairly familiar with, and we also just got a pretty sweet new removal spell in Lash of Malice, which, unlike things like Deadweight, you know, it's not an enchantment, it's actually an instant, so this will proc Magecraft. I think that's cool, but again, I think you need to be very careful how much actual removal you end up playing. Like, I would rather play Unsubstantiate than a card like this, because Unsubstantiate, again, is not only a a counter spell or a removal spell against creature on the board state, much the way Lash is, but it's also a protection spell, right? It pulls double duty. We need cards like that. Again, Fight as One protects our creatures and pumps them at the same time with a +1/+1 bonus. We need our spells to do as much as possible in this deck if we're going to consider playing them, and I'm just not sure that straight up removal that doesn't do anything else and we can't cast and get a boost on our guys if our opponent doesn't have a target for it, or if we're playing against control or whatever. I'm just not sure that it's 100% worth the opportunity cost in the main deck to play cards that are just removal and nothing else. Now, you could also play Duress and Agonizing Remorse in the deck, although Agonizing Remorse is a little expensive, even just at 2 mana. It's sorcery speed, right? Your opponent might not always have cards in their hand, but you can always cast this card, right? You can always cast Agonizing Remorse. You can always cast Duress. So, unlike a removal spell, even if your opponent doesn't have any cards in their hand, you can at least cast the card and get a bonus on your Lumimancer, your Light Scribe, or whatever. So they got that going for them, and they also proactively get things that might kill your Lumimancer out of your opponent's hand. So I especially like cards like Duress in this deck. I'm just not 100% sure that A, it's worth the opportunity cost to put the card in your deck in the first place, or B, that it's really worth making this deck Orzhov in the first place, and that pains me to say because I love Orzhov. Again, I'm just not sure that either one of these are where you want to be. But if you are playing Orzhov, I think you play a 3 or 4 of Duress in this main deck, just to keep it clear. Now, there are pretty cool reasons to play Orzhov, right? You get Call of the Death Dweller, which can bring back a Light Scribe and a Lumimancer at the same time, which I think is really cool. But you can also play, like, Hunt for Specimens or Village Rites. Like, these are all cards that are worth playing. Hunt for Specimens at least draws you a card. It's a spell, procs Magecraft, draws you into more stuff to play more spells, and it puts a body on the battlefield that can get Light Scribe pumps or Show of Confidence counters. Maybe there are reasons to play Hunt for Specimens. Village Rites, if your opponent actually does have a removal spell and it has to go through, at least this draws you into more gas. 2 cards is an awful lot for 1 mana. And of course, you can just sack a small creature, or a creature you don't care about, pump your Lumimancer with the Village Rites, draw 2 cards, keep playing things, pump your Lumimancer more. So I like the idea behind Village Rites. And Cling to Dust is just 1 mana to draw a card, and you can then escape it as the game goes on. Again, you don't really want the game to get to a state where you can escape this, because that's a lot of cards in your yard. That's a lot of mana to be spending on 1 spell. If the game has gotten to that point, you're probably not in a very good position, but at least you can escape it if the game does get to that point. Drawing a card is very important, and this is basically the only black card that's like 1 mana draw card. Now, I do want to point out Fruit of Tizarus here, because again, 1 mana that also escapes for actually a relatively low escape cost in terms of how many cards have to be in your yard. And it's just extra damage, You throw 1 mana at this, you deal 2 to your opponent, you pump your Lumimancer by 2, you escape it later, you hit your opponent for another 2, right? I mean, I actually don't think Fruit of Tizarus is a great card, but I at least wanted to point it out in the kind of, I guess, what's become the sleeper section of every color's spell pile, right? Just remember that Fruit of Tizarus exists. I don't think that it's amazing or anything, but, Black gets to play an escapable shock, and that's at least worth looking at, I think. Now, when I say there are very few black creatures I would play in this deck, I mean it. There is 1 black creature I would play in this deck, and that's Sedgemoor Witch, and even it's a little bit iffy because 3 mana is a lot. If you've gone Light Scribe turn 1, or excuse me, Lumimancer turn 1, Light Scribe turn 2, Witch turn 3, well, your opponent just, I don't know, Doomskar, Shatter the Sky, names odd on their extinction event. And you just did all that setting up for nothing. Starting on turn 3, you usually want to be attacking in this deck. So I'm not super interested in creatures that cost 3 mana. That's why I didn't even say anything about Elite Spellbinder for the white creatures, right? Because I'm just not sure I want to play 3 mana dudes in this deck. But if there's one 3 mana creature in all of Standard that you'd want to play in this deck, it is Sedgemoor Witch, baby. So let's move on to red, a color that I think has a ton of promise, and there are some cards I specifically really, really like in red. Crash Through might just be the single best card for this deck in all of Standard, and no, I'm really not trying to be hyperbolic here. I kind of actually believe that. But there's also things like Academic Dispute, which do an interesting impression of cards like Crash Through, right? Academic Dispute in Limited, I have come to learn, basically says destroy target creature for 1 red mana, so that's pretty sick. I mean, depending on your board state, it's often a fight spell, is what it amounts to. So you've got that going for you in this deck too, make their one good creature block that they weren't otherwise going to block with, make the Lumimancer huge, get in, kill that guy. And that does happen a lot. This also gives a Lumimancer reach sometimes, although that's like the least used mode on the card. We're looking to attack rather than block if we can help it, but sometimes it comes up. But this also effectively draws a card for just 1 mana. So Academic Dispute actually isn't terrible, especially if you are leaning on cards like Academic Probation in the board. Just saying, 1 mana for Guiding Voice is good. It learns, it pumps. This doesn't pump, but it does learn for just 1 mana, and that's something you want to look at. But Crash Through is the truth. There's a reason that I hype this card so much. I don't know that you absolutely have to play red in this deck, but if you play red, you absolutely have to play Crash Through. There's no other way around it. This not only draws a card for 1 mana, but the trample on your entire team is incredibly important, right? There's going to be a lot of times where Lumimancer gets to, double-digit power. Lightscribe gets to double-digit power, especially after a show of confidence. But there's just not really much you can do with that. Your opponents just chump block with like little guys, and you're kind of back to square one. If you didn't draw any cards in that exchange, you're kind of down in that exchange, right? So, it's just a real feel bad, but Crash Through, giving all of your creatures trample is just an unbelievable boost. It's just crazy to me how good this card can be, because your opponent can chump block all they want. They're still going to take like 40 in that turn. So just Crash Through has been integral to the Boros version of this deck's plan. But on that same tip, we've also got things like Run Amok that you could play, or maybe even Barge In. Now, Barge In gives your whole team team trample, except for your Lumimancer, which is a feel bad. But, you've still got Lightscribe. Whatever other non-human creatures you choose to play in the deck will often get very big off of Lightscribe and Show of Confidence. So sometimes Barge In can be worth like a 2-of in the deck, because even though, again, it doesn't let your Lumimancer trample through, it still lets the rest of your team trample through, and they'll be pretty big too. So I haven't been disliking Barge In, but Run Amok cost a little bit much, but it is +5/+5 and trample to a Lumimancer, so 2 mana don't sound too bad. And of course, if you're looking for pump spells, red has got you, kid. You got Infuriate, which you might want to play if you play red, but probably the best red pump spell, almost certainly the best red pump spell, is Unleash Fury. Very often you can get a Lumimancer to 10 power, but you can't finish the game, right? Well, it's pretty easy to get it to 20 power if you have an Unleash Fury in your hand. And of course, this also combos pretty well with like Kazul's Fury if you've got the 5 mana to do it in the late game. So that can be nice if you want to play Kazul's Fury. By the way, editors note, do not play Fling in this deck. I don't think it's worth the card slot. But Kazul's Fury can be a land, so the opportunity cost is much lower. I think if you are going to play Kazul's Fury, you just play like 1 or 2 copies. You don't go all the way, because the deck does not want tap lands. But if you're doing the Unleash Fury plan, Kazul's Fury can be a nice card to have access to, and if you play red in the deck, I think you almost always want Unleash Fury. And of course, red has access to spells like Spikefield Hazard and Shock that are just like 1 mana and deal damage. Pretty much everyone that I've seen try to build a Boros version of this deck online, a couple of different streamers and YouTubers and whatnot, have not included Shock originally and then decided that they needed some number of Shock as games begun to be played. And I think that's right. I think a 2-of Shock is probably where you want to be, maybe even a 4-of, because some removal is good to have. And I guess for the red sleeper spell, we'll look at Satyr's Cunning. Now, I have seen some very good Magic players talk up this card in this deck, but I'm still not sure. It is a body that's also an instant or sorcery that has a super low escape cost. Maybe not in terms of mana, although 3 it could be a lot worse than 3, right? 3's not terrible, but it only costs a couple of cards to escape, right? So puts more bodies on the table as an instant or as a sorcery. It pumps your Lumimancers. I mean, there's a lot of good things about Satyr's Cunning, and you're not really looking to block that much in this deck. You don't really care that much about blocking, so the fact that token can't block isn't a big deal. You just want another token for Light Scribe and Show of Confidence and whatnot. So, and it's only 1 mana. You know, I think it's worth looking at Satyr's Cunning. If you're building the Boros version of the deck and you have like 2 slots left you don't know what to do with, Satyr's Cunning is probably a good place to start. Now, there aren't a buttload of red creatures I really want to look at either, to be honest with you. I think a lot of the best creatures for this deck are just in white. But, you know, there is Bone Crusher Giant, which is not only a spell, but it's also a big, beefy man creature. It's a big old giant, man. So that's good. The body isn't bad for the mana cost and all that. If your opponent does try to take it out, it sometimes deals damage to them, and we care about that. So Bone Crusher is not terrible, but it is a little bit mana intensive for what the deck's trying to do. Speaking of mana intensive, I've even seen some people try to fit Goldspan Dragon into the Boros version of the deck, which I think is actually kind of interesting, but 5 mana is so much. This deck does often want to get to 5 mana. It wants to get to turn 5. It just doesn't really want to drop a Goldspan Dragon on turn 5. That said, it's a great way to answer a sweeper. You know, if your opponent does get the sweeper off and they kill your Lumimancer, your Light Scribe, and all that stuff, just drop a Goldspan. Immediately swing with Ace, Defiant Strike it, and get mana back for that and draw a card. Like, there's a lot of cool things about Goldspan Dragon. It goes pretty well with like Unleash Fury and stuff like that. Especially with Unleash Fury and Kazul's Fury, you get some pretty crazy stuff happening. You know, if you've got a Leonin Light Scribe out, or you play a Show of Confidence, then suddenly, you know, Goldspan Dragon can go crazy, either making treasures or just getting huge. So I like the idea of Dragon, but I think that it's way too expensive to like really play in this deck, especially in the main. Now, the creatures in red that I'm a little bit more excited about are things like Rimrock Knight, good old Charles Barkley, and Heartfire Immolator. You know, I think that Heartfire, if there's a deck for it in the format, it might be this deck. You know, it effectively has a Magecraft ability. It's got prowess. It gets a little bit bigger whenever we play stuff. It goes pretty well with Light Scribe, Show of Confidence, and other things that, you know, make it bigger along with its own prowess ability, so it can get really big. And when it does get really big, sometimes if we have an extra mana laying around, we just kill the Lovestruck Beast that would otherwise be a problem. So, you know, I think Heartfire Immolator is actually a really interesting choice of inclusion for the deck. And if there's a single red creature in all of Standard that I'm interested in trying out in this deck, it's probably Immolator. But, you know, Charles Barkley isn't bad too. Again, we don't really care that much about not being able to block in this deck, or at least theoretically we don't. So, you know, I don't really care about the fact that our 3/1 can't block. I just care that it's 2 mana for a 3-power creature that also has an instant sorcery pump spell, or sorcery, yes, an instant pump spell stapled to it. So it's just obviously pretty good with Lumimancer and stuff. It's just, I have tried a 2 of, you know, Rimrock Knight in a couple of these Boros builds and haven't been as impressed by it as I would have liked, but I still have some faith in it. You know, we want pump spells, we want them to be cheap, and we want creatures, and this just fulfills all of those conditions. It's not a bad card. But let's look at green, and green is a color that doesn't have a whole lot to choose from, but it really does objectively have some of the better spells we could be playing. Things like Ranger's Guile, Snakeskin Veil, you know, these are right up there with Fight as One in terms of protection spells in the format. Obviously, Snakeskin Veil is just strictly better than Ranger's Guile, so I don't think you'll be playing Guile too much, because you want to play, you know, Snakeskin Veil and Fight as One, and then probably stop there in terms of at least 1 mana protection spells. You might also try to find a way to fudge in Sajiri Shelter or something, but I really don't think you end up playing Guile. That said, Snakeskin Veil is an incredible, just 1 mana, puts a +1/+1 counter and protects it from a removal spell. Just unbelievable card, you know. Unlike Fight as One, this doesn't necessarily save your creatures from as many combat situations, but just being able to counter the removal spell is important enough a lot of the time. And Snakeskin Veil is very hot on Fight as One's heels as like the best protection spell in Standard. So it in and of itself is a good reason to play green. But green also has cool fight spells like Mage Duel and Blizzard Brawl. I'm especially interested in Blizzard Brawl, and I wish that the speed on this was a little bit better, but this can at least give a Lumimancer indestructible for a turn, which can be important, right? Especially if you want to bait your opponent. You know, you go ahead and cast Blizzard Brawl, threaten to give it indestructible, your opponent puts a removal spell on the stack, and that's when you cast the Fight as One or the Snakeskin Veil or something. So, you know, sometimes you can bait your opponent that way, but more often you just want this to give your guy indestructible and you don't have to protect it beyond that. You know, so, but it's also just 1 mana to give a Lumimancer a pump outside of the pump it would get off of Magecraft, right? It gets +1/+0 and indestructible, and it fights a thing. For just 1 mana, that is an unbelievable spell. So, you know, and even if you don't cast any other spells before it, If you just have a Lumimancer, it's dealing 3 damage to something with Indestructible. So, I don't know. It's not Blizzard Brawl isn't terrible. And if you're going to play a fight spell in the deck, this is one of the better ones. But, you know, Mage Duel is not terrible either, I guess. Obviously, this is going to just cost you 1 mana a lot of the time. But, again, I think if you're playing a fight spell, you try to make the Snowlands work. And finally, in green spells, there are things like Adventurous Impulse and Charge Through. Now, Impulse can help you find a Lumimancer or Lightscribe on turn 1 if you didn't start the game with one, but you probably should have mulliganed in that case, right? You want one of them in your opening hand a lot of the time, but, you know, still, Adventurous Impulse is just 1 mana to dig, and sometimes this will just find you a land that you need, right? I mean, the deck needs 4, sometimes 5 lands to really do all the things it wants to do, so that land can be important, and there are going to be board states where you just want to cast a cheap spell. It doesn't even matter what it does, but when this does find you another Lightscribe or something, it's going to be really, really good. So for just 1 mana, I would consider it, but obviously Charge Through is a really good spell. It's not as good as Crash Through by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, it's literally objectively strictly worse in a lot of ways than Crash Through. But, you know, if you want to play green and not red, Charge Through can still give the Lightscribe or the Lumimancer trample and get through for a turn while drawing a card for just 1 mana. So, again, I think this is one of those cards that's kind of meant for limited because I'm not totally sure that you want to be playing like Selesnya Lumimancer in standard. So this might be meant for your Magecraft triggers in limited, but it's still worth pointing out because 1 mana to draw a card and get the Lumimancer through for a turn is actually a really good, you know, investment. But unbelievably, green does have some creatures that I'm really interested in. It just doesn't have a whole lot, right? We've got things like Kyrion Dryad, and more importantly, I think, Dragon's Guard Elite, which is like one of the best Kyrion Dryads ever printed. But if I'm going to talk about Elite, I should probably also bring up Dryad because it's in the format. It would also be a decent creature for the deck. You know, if you're looking to get to 16 creatures, I could see playing 4 Lumimancer, 4 Lightscribe, 4 Dryad, right? So, and 4 Elite. So, but Elite is obviously the better card here. Late in the game, if you do have the mana but not the spells, you can double the number of counters on this. It's just naturally good against, you know, things like Heartless Act and whatnot. It's great with protection spells. You know, imagine targeting this with a Snakeskin Veil. It gets 2 +1/+1 counters, plus the hexproof. Pretty silly, right? So I actually think Elite is one of the better reasons to play green, period. But I'm still not sure that it puts me in green when I'm building this deck. Now, finally, we got some gold and, I guess, other stuff to look at. But as far as gold spells, there really aren't a whole lot that I want to talk about, but there are things that are worth at least looking at. Things like Humiliate, Expressive Iteration, and Decisive Denial. You know, if you're in the proper color combination, I think all of these are good. Humiliate is a wonderful card. I've been playing Orzhov, I guess, Tempo for at least a week now. It's my favorite deck in Standard, period. It's not even my favorite new Strixhaven deck. It's just my favorite deck in Standard. And this is actually a huge part of that deck. Humiliate is wonderful, and it gets removal spells out of your opponent's hand, sweepers out of your opponent's hand, while growing your Lumimancer with the counter and the Magecraft bonus. So, Humiliate is pretty silly, guys. I would play it if I was in Orzhov, but it's probably not a good enough reason to just play Orzhov. Right? But as far as Expressive Iteration, I really like the way this would work in like a Jeskai deck with See the Truth or something. But, you know, the problem with cards like Expressive Iteration and Decisive Denial are that you'd have to play a 3-color deck to play with these cards. And I'm just not sure that you want to be doing that, right? Especially with Pathways out there is like the best dual land we could possibly play. I could really see, you know, playing a Pathway for white on turn 1 to play a Lumimancer. And then on turn 2, well, you just can't play Expressive Iteration. On turn 3, you might still not be able to play Expressive Iteration. So I'm just not sure that 3-color decks are really where you want to be with Lumimancer in general. But if you must play Bant, if you must play Jeskai, these are definitely cards you want to be looking at. Now, in terms of gold creatures, I kind of have the same problem, right? Sprite Dragon looks really good. Even Magecraft Apprentice looks somewhat decent, but as good as Sprite Dragon looks, I just don't think you really want to play Jeskai. You know, again, it's just way too awkward to drop Needleverge Pathway for white on turn 1 and drop Lumimancer, and then turn 2, whoops, I can't play my Sprite Dragon, and like, that's just, I don't like the idea behind it. Even if Sprite Dragon is super tempting, I don't think it goes in the deck. But some gold creatures that are on color that would help put me in different colors are Killian and especially Lurrus. Now, if you're just playing the mono white version of the deck, you can play Lurrus. You can either play Lurrus as your companion, or if you just absolutely must play the 2 or 3 of Mavinda, you can just play Lurrus as your other 3-drop, and that could work too. I really like the idea of Lurrus in this deck one way or the other, almost no matter what color combination you end up in. You know, you end up in Boros, you can still play Lurrus. So, you know, I think Lurrus is actually one of the better cards for the deck, period, in all of Standard, because we really can't play too many creatures. Our creatures are very important to us. When we lose them, we'd really like to get them back. So I like the idea behind Lurrus, but Killian, not so much. You know, a lot of our spells already just cost the 1 mana anyway, so Killian doesn't give us a huge bonus. When Killian does give us a bonus, I'm not sure that it's really worth it, but I don't know. The Menace is at least a way to get through with evasion, in a way. It's the worst evasion ability, but at least it's an evasion ability. And the lifelink could help too, especially if Killy gets really big in a turn. So I'm not going to completely handwave Killian away or anything like that. I think that it could be okay. But again, I'm just not sure I'm seeing enough reasons for the deck to be Orzhov to make me super excited about the Killian version of Illumamancer deck. But we did it, everybody. We're on the other side. Here's my face. That is almost every card that I would consider playing if I was going to build Illumamancer in this format right now. And I say almost because I didn't bring up Showdown of the Skalds. This is a card I see a lot in a lot of the Boros Illumamancer builds, and honestly, y'all, I'm not convinced this isn't just like way too clunky. Again, on turn 4, we don't want to play an enchantment. We want to win the game on turn 4 a lot of the time. This can give us extra gas and all that, but of all the cards that people think are just like absolute auto-includes for the Boros deck, I gotta tell you, I don't necessarily think this is one. I think it's a great card. I think it's good for this deck even, but as far as being an auto-include, no, I saved Showdown to the end to let you know that after playing with the Boros version of the deck for a while, I'm not 100% sure that this is where we want to be honest with you. Good card, though. Good. Not saying it's bad. Just not saying it's actually optimal for the deck, that's all. But if I was going to build Illumamancer right now, which I have done many different ways in preparation for this video and just in preparation for the format at large, I would probably go Boros right now. I think that Boros has a lot of good pump spells, and just because you play red doesn't mean you have to sacrifice cheap spells that draw your cards. You still get Crash Through, Academic Dispute if you want it, and a lot of really cool stuff. So if you want to see me playing what I think is the best version of the deck, I will be doing that on Twitch on Sunday night around 8 p.m. EST. So go to twitch.tv/spmtgdev. Hit the link in the description if you'd rather do it that way. It's much faster and you don't have to remember words. And I'll take you over to my Twitch channel you can follow. And I will be playing the Boros or a Boros version of this deck on Sunday night for you. I promise you that much. But there are a lot of ways to build this, and I think mono white might be the key. But it could be something I don't see. Maybe Orzhov is better than I think it is. Maybe Selesnya is better than I think it is. Maybe it's easier to add a third color than I'm giving it credit for, right? There's a lot of stones to overturn and find out what you like, because at the end of the day, that's what matters. Your playstyle, the cards you enjoy personally playing the most. How do you want to build this deck, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to cover today, and not just give you a boring old stale deck tech, play it like this. No, like, these are all the cards I think are worthy of considering. And if I didn't mention them, it doesn't mean they're not worthy of considering, but they probably aren't. Just get at me in the comments section. Let me know anything that I missed, right? Like if I missed a huge important card that you think goes in every version of this deck and puts you in black no matter what or whatever. Like let me know in the comments section and we'll have a discussion. But for now, I guess that's it. I guess I'll just remind you to like and subscribe if you haven't done those things yet. Looking to get to 125k subs, y'all. So help me do that if you haven't subbed yet. It would mean a lot to me. Hit the bell for the notes and all that. Check out the Patreon. Just $1 a month to vote on content. That's why you're seeing this video. That's what the patrons voted for. Although it was very close between this and Orzhov Tempo. It was super close. So if you want to affect what have been very close votes recently, it's just $1 a month to do it. Hit the link in the description. Check out the Patreon. Really helps the channel a lot. But even if you don't do that, I'm just glad that you're here. Thanks for your viewership. It means a lot to me, and I hope you enjoyed this one. But for now, I got to get to editing, so I'm going to get my butthole on the roll, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind. Yeah, I'm feeling rich, and I'm finally about to cash out. Smothered and covered like I'm some hash browns. Glass clown, stash crowns till I pass out. Bass, trout, lobster on my plate.